By the mid-1700s, the world on America's eastern shores was changing rapidly. 13 colonies, once scattered outposts of the British Empire, had grown restless. Taxes were raised without representation. Laws were passed without consent. The spirit of independence was rising, carried in whispers in taverns, in pamphlets on street corners, and in fiery speeches that lit up public halls. In 1773 in Boston Harbor, protesters disguised as Mohawk warriors hurled crates of British tea into the sea. It was more than defiance. It was a declaration that they would no longer bow to kings an ocean away. The fuse had been lit. By 1775, the sound of gunfire cracked across the morning air at Lexington and Concord. Farmers, blacksmiths, and school teachers, ordinary colonists, stood against one of the most powerful armies in the world. The American Revolution had begun. On July 4, 1776, delegates gathered in Philadelphia to sign the Declaration of Independence. Its words still echo through time. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It was a radical vision, a promise that freedom and self-government could define a nation. But behind the stirring language lay contradictions. The very men who declared liberty often denied it to others. Enslaved Africans continued to labor in chains. Women were denied the right to vote or hold office. Native peoples were excluded entirely from the vision of this new republic. America was born in paradox, its ideals soaring, but its realities painfully flawed. And yet those words carried power. They lit a flame of possibility, one that generations of Americans would later fight to make real. The war itself was brutal. Families were divided, neighbors became enemies. Cities burned, crops withered, and thousands died. But the resilience of the colonists, their belief in liberty, proved stronger than the might of empire. At Yorktown in 1781, the British surrendered. A new nation stood on the world stage. But victory was only the beginning. The new United States was fragile, its future uncertain. The Constitution, drafted in 1787, attempted to bind the states together under a shared vision. Checks and balances, freedoms and responsibilities, power held not by kings but by the people. Still, questions lingered. Who counted as the people? Who truly belonged in the promise of liberty? The Revolution gave America its identity, bold, defiant, unafraid to dream of something new. But it also left an unfinished mission, to live up to the very ideals it declared to the world. The Revolution was not the end of the story. It was the opening chapter of a nation that would spend centuries wrestling with its own promise. From the trenches of Gallipoli to the deserts of North Africa, from the jungles of Vietnam to modern peacekeeping across the world, the Australian Army has marched through history, shaped by courage, sacrifice, and resilience. Today, we'll uncover the story of the Army of Australia, its origins, its battles, and how it continues to protect the nation and its allies in the 21st century. This is the legacy of the Diggers and the Army of Australia. When Australia became a nation in 1901, it was not just a political union of 6 colonies. It was also the beginning of a united defense. Before Federation, each colony had its own small army and militia, mostly made up of volunteers. Their equipment, training, and organization varied widely. Some had cavalry units, others had artillery, and many relied on citizen soldiers who drilled only on weekends. The first responsibility of the new Commonwealth was clear: to create a single, unified fighting force. On the 1st of March 1901, all colonial military forces officially transferred to the Commonwealth of Australia. This marked the birth of the Australian Army as we know it today. But the new army faced challenges from the very beginning. Australia was a vast continent with a small population, just under 4 million people at the time. Defending such a large landmass was a daunting task. To make matters more complex, Australia was still heavily dependent on Britain for protection, particularly against naval threats. The Army's role, therefore, was not only to defend Australia's shores, but also to contribute to Britain's wars abroad, and that opportunity came sooner than expected. Even before Federation, Australians had already volunteered to fight in the Second Boer War in South Africa, beginning in 1899. After Federation, the Commonwealth continued sending troops. The Boer War was a harsh introduction to modern warfare. The enemy, Boer farmers fighting for independence from the British Empire, were skilled horsemen, sharpshooters, and masters of guerrilla tactics. Australians proved especially suited to this style of fighting. Their experience as bushmen, riders, and marksmen gave them a natural advantage in the open terrain of South Africa. Over 16,000 Australians served in the Boer War. They fought in key battles such as the relief of Kimberley and the capture of Bloemfontein. But much of their work was in smaller, mobile units, riding through the veld, hunting down Boer commandos, and enduring long patrols with little food or water. For the first time, Australians fought under the banner of a new nation. Their courage and adaptability drew praise from British commanders, but the war was not without controversy. Some Australians were accused of harsh treatment of prisoners, and others faced court-martial for battlefield decisions made in the chaos of guerrilla warfare. These incidents revealed the challenges of commanding a young and independent-minded force. By the war's end in 1902, more than 600 Australians had died, many not from bullets but from disease, a grim reminder of the harsh conditions of overseas service. The Boer War left a lasting legacy. It gave the new army valuable experience in mounted warfare, marksmanship, and field tactics. It also began to shape a unique military identity, one based not on rigid discipline like the British, but on initiative, resourcefulness, and mateship. Between 1902 and 1914, the Army continued to evolve. Compulsory military training for young men was introduced in 1911, ensuring a steady reserve of trained soldiers. Military academies were established, and defense planning became more structured. Still, few could have imagined the scale of the storm that was about to break in 1914, a war that would test the Army and the nation like never before. In 1914, just 13 years after Federation, Australia was still a young nation. When Britain declared war on Germany on the 4th of August, Australia automatically followed. Many Australians saw it as their duty to defend the empire, but also as a chance for adventure, travel, and to prove the strength of this new nation on the world stage. By the end of the war, over 416,000 Australians had enlisted from a population of fewer than 5 million. It was a massive commitment, one that would change Australia forever. In April 1915, the first major test came at Gallipoli, in modern-day Turkey. Australian and New Zealand soldiers, fighting together as the ANZACs, were tasked with seizing the Dardanelles Strait, a key route to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. But the landing at Gallipoli on April 25, 1915 was a disaster. The ANZACs came ashore on steep cliffs under heavy fire. The beaches were narrow, the ground was rough, and the Turkish defenders, led by the brilliant commander Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, were determined to hold the line. For 8 long months, the soldiers endured heat, flies, poor food, and disease, all while facing relentless artillery and sniper fire. Trenches were dug just meters apart. Life was a cycle of mud, exhaustion, and terror. Yet through this suffering, a spirit was born. The ANZACs became known for their courage, their irreverent humor in the face of hardship, and above all, their loyalty to each other. The idea of mateship. Though Gallipoli was ultimately a military failure, costing over 8,700 Australian lives, it gave rise to something greater, the ANZAC legend. A story of sacrifice and resilience that became central to Australia's national identity. After Gallipoli, Australian forces were redeployed to the Western Front in France and Belgium. Here, the scale of war was even more brutal. The trenches stretched for hundreds of kilometers, and soldiers lived in constant mud, surrounded by barbed wire, machine guns, and the terror of poison gas. The Australians played a key role in some of the bloodiest battles of the war. At Fromelles in 1916, Australia suffered its single worst day in history, over 5,500 casualties in just 24 hours. At Pozières, they faced weeks of relentless shelling where entire units were wiped out. Yet despite the carnage, they pressed on. By 1917, Australian divisions were at the forefront of attacks at Bullecourt, Messines, and Passchendaele, enduring unimaginable losses in seas of mud. In 1918, with German forces launching a final desperate offensive, Australian troops were among those who held the line. Under General John Monash, a brilliant Australian commander, the Army earned a reputation for tactical innovation and relentless determination. At the Battle of Hamel in July 1918, Monash orchestrated a perfectly timed combined arms attack involving infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft. It lasted just 93 minutes and was hailed as a model of modern warfare. Later that year, Australians spearheaded the Allied advance in the Hundred Days Offensive, helping to break the German army and bring the war to an end. Yet victory came at an unimaginable cost. Of the 416,000 Australians who enlisted, more than 60,000 were killed and 156,000 were wounded, gassed, or taken prisoner. For a nation of only 5 million, this was devastating. Almost every community lost someone. Families mourned fathers, sons, and brothers. Entire towns were scarred. The scale of grief was unlike anything Australia had ever known. The war also left psychological scars. Many returned soldiers suffered from what was then called shell shock, now recognized as PTSD. Reintegration into civilian life was not easy. Some veterans never fully recovered, but out of this tragedy came a lasting legacy. The ANZAC spirit, courage, mateship, sacrifice, and endurance became a defining part of what it meant to be Australian. Every year on April 25th, ANZAC Day is commemorated, not to glorify war but to remember those who served and those who never came home. World War I was not just a war that tested the army. It was the crucible in which the young Australian nation forged its identity. The army entered 1914 as a small, untested force. By 1918, it had become one of the most respected fighting forces in the world. When World War II broke out in September 1939, Australia once again stood by Britain. Prime Minister Robert Menzies declared, "Great Britain has declared war upon Germany, and that as a result, Australia is also at war." Just like in 1914, Australians volunteered in huge numbers. But this time, the war would not only be fought in faraway Europe. For the first time, the Australian homeland itself was under direct threat, the European and North African fronts. In 1941, Australian troops became famous as the Rats of Tobruk. At the Libyan port of Tobruk, 14,000 Australians, alongside British and Polish forces, held out against Rommel's elite German Afrika Korps. For 8 months, they endured constant shelling, tank assaults, and dive bomber attacks. Living underground in dugouts and tunnels, they earned the nickname Rats. But what was meant as an insult became a badge of honor. The Rats of Tobruk showed that Australians would not be intimidated by the feared German army. In battles such as Bardia, El Alamein, and Crete, Australians proved themselves once again as tough, determined fighters. But while they were fighting far from home, danger was creeping ever closer to Australian shores. In December 1941, Japan entered the war by attacking Pearl Harbor. Within weeks, they swept through Southeast Asia, capturing Singapore in February 1942. Among the 15,000 Allied prisoners taken were over 15,000 Australians, the largest surrender in Australia's military history. The fall of Singapore sent shockwaves through Australia. For decades, Australians had believed the British Navy would protect them. Now Britain was fighting for its own survival, and Australia was largely on its own. Then, on February 19, 1942, war came to Australian soil. Japanese aircraft bombed the northern city of Darwin in 2 massive raids. More than 240 people were killed, ships were sunk in the harbor, and the city was devastated. Over the next 2 years, northern Australia would be bombed more than 90 times. Submarines even attacked Sydney Harbor. For the first time in its history, Australia faced a real fear of invasion. The Japanese aimed to capture Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea as a base to isolate Australia. When their seaborne invasion failed, they tried to march across the rugged Kokoda track. Here, young and poorly trained Australian militia units, many just teenagers, stood in their way. Fighting through thick jungle, mud, torrential rain, and disease, they faced a determined Japanese advance. The Kokoda campaign was one of the most brutal in Australia's history. Soldiers carried heavy packs up near vertical tracks, often fighting hand-to-hand in the darkness of the jungle. Food was scarce. Malaria and dysentery spread, and ammunition was always running low. But the Australians, supported by the heroic efforts of Papua New Guinean carriers, often remembered as the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, slowly pushed the Japanese back. By November 1942, the Japanese retreat marked a turning point in the Pacific War. The victory at Kokoda, like Gallipoli in the First World War, became a defining moment in the Australian Army's story, proof that they could defend their own region against a powerful enemy. Other Pacific campaigns. Australian soldiers went on to fight in campaigns across the Pacific, at Milne Bay, where they handed Japan its first major land defeat of the war, in the jungles of Buna, Gona, and Sanananda, and later in Borneo and Bougainville. These campaigns were not only militarily important but also symbolic, showing that Australia was no longer just following Britain into war, but taking responsibility for defending its own region. While soldiers fought abroad, the home front played a vital role. Thousands of Australian women joined the armed services for the first time, serving as nurses, clerks, drivers, and mechanics in the Australian Women's Army Service and other units. Civilians endured rationing of food, fuel, and clothing. Cities along the coast prepared for invasion with air raid drills and blackouts. The war effort brought the entire nation into the struggle. The shift from Britain to America-Australia's alliances. With Britain weakened, Australia turned increasingly to the United States for support. American troops arrived in Australia in 1942, and General Douglas MacArthur used Australia as a base for his campaign to drive Japan back across the Pacific. This partnership marked the beginning of the close US-Australia alliance that continues to this day. In 1945, the war finally came to an end with the surrender of Germany in May and Japan in August, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For Australia, the cost had been heavy. Nearly 1 million men and women had served. More than 39,000 Australians were killed, and around 30,000 became prisoners of war, many enduring brutal captivity on the Thai-Burma Railway and in Japanese camps. The war had transformed Australia. It was no longer a distant outpost of the British Empire. It had fought across 2 oceans, defended its homeland, and begun forging its own independent place in the world. World War II cemented the reputation of the Australian Army as a resilient, resourceful, and determined force. From the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Kokoda, they had faced the most dangerous moments in the nation's history and prevailed. The legacy of their courage and sacrifice lives on in memorials, in the stories of veterans, and in the continued spirit of service that defines the Army today. After the guns of World War II fell silent, Australia entered a new era. The Cold War had begun, a global struggle between communism and democracy. For the Australian Army, this meant new wars, fought in faraway lands, often under the banner of international alliances. In June 1950, North Korean forces, backed by the Soviet Union and later China, invaded South Korea. The United Nations called for military support to repel the invasion. Australia was one of the first nations to answer the call, committing ships, aircraft, and ground troops. The 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 3RAR, became the centerpiece of Australia's army contribution. Fighting alongside American, British, and other UN forces, Australians endured freezing winters, mountainous terrain, and a determined enemy. One of their most famous actions came at the Battle of Kapyong in April 1951. Vastly outnumbered, 3RAR, supported by Canadian and New Zealand troops, held a crucial position against relentless Chinese assaults. Their stubborn defense stopped a major breakthrough and earned them a U.S. Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest honors a unit can receive. By the time the armistice was signed in July 1953, 17,000 Australians had served in Korea. More than 340 were killed, and over 1,200 wounded. Though sometimes called the Forgotten War, Korea marked the beginning of Australia's role as a consistent military contributor to United Nations missions. In 1962, Australia sent military advisors to South Vietnam as part of a US-led effort to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, the so-called domino theory. By 1965, full combat units were deployed, and in 1966 Australia introduced conscription through a lottery system to boost army numbers. Young men as young as 20 were drafted, sparking nationwide debates and protests. Australian troops operated mainly in Puak Tui province, establishing a base at Nui Dat. Their mission was to patrol villages, disrupt Viet Cong supply lines, and win local support through civic action. The army faced a new kind of war, jungle warfare. Thick forests concealed ambushes, booby traps, and hidden tunnels. Soldiers often never saw the enemy until the first shots were fired. It was a war of patrols, sudden firefights, and constant tension. The most famous battle came at Long Tan on August 18, 1966. In heavy rain, 108 Australian soldiers from D Company 6RAR were ambushed by a force of over 2,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops. For hours they held their ground, supported by artillery fire and last-minute resupply by helicopters. By the end, 18 Australians were killed and 24 wounded. but the enemy suffered hundreds of casualties. Long Tan became a symbol of extraordinary courage and endurance. Over the decade-long conflict, nearly 60,000 Australians served in Vietnam. More than 500 were killed and over 3,000 wounded. Many veterans returned home with psychological scars that would last a lifetime. But unlike the homecoming after World War II, Vietnam veterans did not always receive a hero's welcome. The war had divided Australian society. Protests filled the streets, students burned draft cards, and returning soldiers were sometimes met with hostility instead of gratitude. It would take decades before the nation fully recognized their service and sacrifice. During the Malayan Emergency, 1948 to 1960, Australian troops helped British and Malayan forces fight communist guerrillas in the jungles of Malaya. It was a long campaign of small patrols, ambushes, and jungle survival, where Australian soldiers became experts in counterinsurgency tactics. In the mid-1960s, Australia again sent troops to the region during the Indonesian confrontation, 1963-1966, supporting Malaysia against Indonesian incursions on the island of Borneo. These secretive jungle operations, often at night, built on the Army's growing reputation for stealth and discipline. These decades transformed the Australian Army. It shifted from a force built for massive wars became less common, the Australian Army began to redefine its role on the world stage. Gone were the days of massive, bloody campaigns like Gallipoli or Kokoda. Instead, a new mission emerged, one focused on peacekeeping, stability, and humanitarian. Came in Rwanda, 1994-1995. In the aftermath of the genocide, Australian medical teams and soldiers witnessed unimaginable for the Army, one rooted in service, resilience, and global responsibility. The Australian digger was no longer just a soldier, but also a peacekeeper, a rescuer, and a humanitarian. As the 21st century dawned, the world changed forever. The attacks of September 11, 2001, brought a new kind of war. A war not between nations, but against terrorism itself. Australia, bound by its alliance with the United States and its commitment to global security, once again sent its soldiers into the heart of conflict. The war in Afghanistan was Australia's longest military engagement. In October 2001, just weeks after the 9/11 attacks, Australian Special Forces joined the US-led Operation Enduring Freedom. Their mission was clear: dismantle the Taliban regime, destroy terrorist training camps, and prevent Afghanistan from ever again becoming a safe haven for extremists. Australia's elite soldiers, the SASR, Special Air Service Regiment, and Commandos, played a vital role in the early stages of the war. They operated deep behind enemy lines, calling in airstrikes, gathering intelligence, and working alongside Afghan allies. In the years that followed, thousands of Australian troops rotated through Uruzgan province, where they trained local security forces, built schools and clinics, and fought in some of the most dangerous valleys of the country. The war was not without cost. 41 Australian soldiers lost their lives in Afghanistan, and hundreds more returned home with wounds both visible and invisible. Many carried the weight of trauma, sparking a national conversation about mental health, veterans' care, and the true price of war. While Afghanistan raged on, another conflict emerged. In 2003, the United States launched the invasion of Iraq, claiming that Saddam Hussein's regime possessed weapons of mass destruction. Australia joined the coalition, deploying around 2,000 personnel in the opening phase of the war under Operation Falconer. Australian forces secured vital oil infrastructure in the south, provided air support with FA-18 Hornets, and deployed special forces who advanced rapidly alongside American troops. After the fall of Baghdad, Australian soldiers remained in Iraq for years, shifting their role from combat to training, reconstruction, and supporting local governance. The Iraq mission was controversial at home. Many Australians questioned whether the war was justified, especially after weapons of mass destruction were never found. Yet for the soldiers on the ground, the task was always the same: carry out their duty with professionalism and courage. By the late 2000s, the Australian Army found itself stretched between two wars. Soldiers rotated from Iraq to Afghanistan, sometimes returning to the battlefield multiple times. Families at home bore the strain, with loved ones away for months or years at a time. In 2009, Australia formally ended its combat role in Iraq, though small contingents remained for training and security missions. Attention shifted fully back to Afghanistan, where the conflict dragged on into a second decade. Australian troops faced fierce resistance from Taliban fighters. In the harsh mountains and deserts of Uruzgan, they built patrol bases, partnered with Afghan National Army units, and carried out counterinsurgency operations. Stories of incredible bravery emerged: soldiers risking their lives to save their mates under fire, medics treating wounded comrades while bullets flew overhead. But there were also darker moments. Investigations later revealed allegations of misconduct by some Special Forces soldiers, leading to a national reckoning about accountability and the ethics of modern warfare. These revelations sparked painful debates about the balance between heroism and responsibility in times of war. By 2014, Australia formally ended major combat operations in Afghanistan, though training missions continued. Finally, in 2021, after nearly 20 years of involvement, the last Australian troops withdrew, just months before the Taliban swept back into power. 2 decades of war had changed the Australian Army forever. It had fought alongside allies in distant lands, endured heavy sacrifices, and proven once again that the digger's spirit of service and mateship lived on. But it had also forced Australia to confront the human cost of war, not only on the battlefield, but back home in the hearts and minds of its veterans. From the sands of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan, Australia's soldiers carried the same legacy forged at Gallipoli and Kokoda: courage, resilience, and an unbreakable bond with their mates. Yet they also carried something new: the weight of fighting in wars where victory was uncertain and the meaning of success was hard to define. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan may have ended, But the Australian Army continues to stand ready in an era of uncertainty. Today, its mission is not only about fighting wars, it's about preparing for the unknown future. The Army of the 21st century is more advanced, more flexible, and more connected than ever before. While the spirit of the digger remains, the tools of the soldier have evolved. Gone are the days when rifles and bayonets defined the battlefield. Today's Army relies on cutting-edge technology. Armored vehicles like the Boxer Combat Reconnaissance Vehicle and the Hawkeye Protected Mobility Vehicle give soldiers greater protection and mobility. Unmanned aerial drones provide eyes in the sky, delivering intelligence and surveillance in real time. Advanced communication systems link soldiers on the ground with commanders and allies across the globe. But technology is only part of the story. The Army invests heavily in training and readiness. Modern Australian soldiers train not only in traditional combat, but also in cybersecurity, peacekeeping, humanitarian response, and disaster relief. In Darwin, Australian troops regularly train alongside American Marines under the Australia-US Force Posture Agreement, ensuring both nations can respond quickly to crises in the Asia-Pacific. Joint exercises with allies like Japan, Indonesia, and the United Kingdom strengthen regional security and cooperation. The Army's role in humanitarian aid and disaster relief remains just as important. When bushfires swept across Australia in 2019-2020, soldiers were on the front lines, evacuating families, delivering supplies, and helping communities rebuild. When floods struck Queensland and New South Wales, the Army was again there, proving that the digger spirit is not confined to foreign battlefields, but alive in the service of the Australian people. Internationally, Australian soldiers continue to serve in peacekeeping missions, from the Middle East to the Pacific Islands, supporting stability, democracy, and humanitarian assistance. Looking ahead, the Army faces new challenges. The rise of cyber warfare, space technology, and artificial intelligence means that future battles may be fought as much with data and satellites as with rifles and tanks. Climate change, too, poses a challenge, with the Army increasingly called to respond to natural disasters at home and abroad. To meet these challenges, the Army is modernizing under Army 2023 and Beyond initiatives, building a force that is agile, high-tech, and ready to respond to threats in the Indo-Pacific region. Yet for all the change, one thing remains the same: the values of the Australian soldier, mateship, courage, endurance, and sacrifice. From the trenches of Gallipoli to the deserts of Afghanistan, and into the challenges of tomorrow, the digger's spirit endures. The Australian Army today is more than just a fighting force. It is a symbol of resilience, service, and responsibility, prepared not only to defend the nation, but to stand by its people, its allies, and humanity itself. And that brings us to today, the story of the Australian Army, from its birth at Federation, through the trenches of Gallipoli, the jungles of Kokoda, the deserts of the Middle East, and into the challenges of the modern world. It's a story of courage, sacrifice, and resilience. A story that belongs not just to soldiers, but to every Australian. If you enjoyed this journey through history and want to see more stories about Australia's past, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching, and as always, let's keep Australia's history alive.